Welcome back to Atlantic Fellows Conversations from the Climate Action Convening in Bogotá, Colombia. I'm Fionnuala Sweeney. In this podcast, we hear from Atlantic Fellow Enamul Mazid Siddique. Enam is an environmental activist and has been working for environmental justice for the fishing community of his home country, Bangladesh.
I'm Enamul Mazid Siddique. I am from Bangladesh. I come from a forest called Chunoti, which is in the eastern coast of Bay of Bengal. I have participated in the Atlantic community through a fellowship, Atlantic Fellows for Social and Economic Equity. I graduated in 2023. My work is diverse. It does include working with many communities like the one that I come from, but also other communities that have similar challenges, but not necessarily the same ones. My work with environmental justice has not been for a very long time. I can say since maybe 2017, but my professional work on environmental conservation is longer. It's from 2012, which means I had a change of heart. The reason I'm saying environmental conservation and environmental justice as two different things is because of my sense of guilt. When I was starting to work as an environmental conservation professional with an international environmental organization, I was a strong believer in nature protection, like nature first and all of that. But then at one point of time, I started to see things on the ground that didn't seem right. It's environmental policies around protection of nature, which are supposed to benefit the people who depend on nature, were not seemingly doing that. It looked like sacrifices by the fisherfolk, by the forest communities, by people who depend on rivers or the ocean. And I started questioning my own work. And that's when I started going towards more of a rights-based approach towards natural resource governance. I work with Oxfam International now. We are a partnership platform for many local and national organizations who are fighting inequalities. And that's what aligns my current work with Atlantic community as well, because it is about inequalities. I see my work on environmental justice as an entry point towards fighting the bigger inequalities because everything is interrelated. I work for a project called Transboundary Rivers of South Asia, which works in Bangladesh, India, Nepal, and Bhutan. We look at transboundary river systems and the decisions that impact the lives of the people who depend on them. The way it works, it's a lot of bilateral treaties between countries which determine how much water gets to pass across borders. But rivers are more than just waters. These are cultures, people's lives, fishes, sediments, and shared history. Borders that we see today are a result of complex colonial processes. They don't necessarily align with what people on the ground live by, like the values they have, the historical links and connections that they have. So as a result, these treaties that govern these transboundary rivers, or even national legislation, they are not necessarily reflective of indigenous values, traditional ways of living with the rivers, and they don't take into account all these other things apart from the quantity of water while they are written, and that has a real life impact. Hilsa, the national fish of Bangladesh, is an anadromous fish, which means it needs to travel from the ocean to the farthest upstream in the rivers and then come back in its life cycle to breed, to live, to thrive. That means it connects all the cultures and nations in its pathway. Cultures who love hilsa as a fish, as a delicacy, but also as part of their food security. And these transboundary river treaties that we have impact all of that. If it does not, and it does not include all the fisherfolk who are dependent on that hilsa fish and their different rights, contextual realities in the ways this fish conservation or management system works, then it impacts their lives. So I can tell you a story from the North Bengal of Bangladesh and Assam state of India. Hilsa, when it goes upstream, these are the places it reaches. It used to reach historically the heart of India as well, until they created a barrage on the river Padma, known as Ganges as well. And that meant all the communities upstream of that barrage do not get hilsa anymore. Now, we don't have a similar barrage in river Brahmaputra, which is the river that connects Assam with Bangladesh. But then in Bangladesh, we have fishing bans, temporal fishing bans. Many months of the year, fisherfolk are not allowed to fish. In some parts, it's complete ban. Some parts, it's particular species of fish or particular size of fish you cannot take. And it's implemented through strong policing. That means fisherfolk become vulnerable and they have a relationship with police which is exploitative. We have seen fisherfolk even getting killed in the process of implementing these fishing bans. Now what that means is that whenever any fisherfolk go to the river for fishing, they either have to bribe the police or they work with criminals who can give them protection. In both ways, they become vulnerable. Now, looking at the availability of fishes in Brahmaputra, North Bengal and Assam I was talking about, they don't get fish all around the year. They get hilsa, for example, only for 2 weeks in a year. And those 2 weeks fall within a 3-week fishing ban, which means the only time they get the fish, it's illegal to fish. And it's one of the most valuable fishes that they get. And that means that 2 weeks income is something that will keep that entire family alive for the year. And if they cannot fish, it means starving for the entire year or leaving their traditional profession or perhaps migrating to another country or another area, which is not fair. Which means the fisherfolk in North Bengal and Assam should have had a different set of regulations, something that was aligned with their traditional values and their ways of managing the river. Same can apply to other parts of Bangladesh, where traditional ways of governing river, protection of fish, protection of aquatic ecosystem has not been reflected in the legislation. And because these legislations were following the colonial legacies that the British left or that evolved in the rules and regulations set by Pakistan when we were occupied by them or under them. And that is unfortunate. We have had many moments of independence and revolutions, but that did not bring back traditional and indigenous ways of living with nature. It still is around making the best possible revenue for the state, and the state that replaced the crown, the state that did not become the state of the people. And that's where my struggle is. I see environmental justice, as I was saying earlier, as a pathway towards greater justice and equality for all of us. And for me, that means the fisherfolk of Bangladesh needs to be in the same space as the most powerful people in the world. If that means the fisherfolk becoming more powerful, that's my work. If that means bringing down the powerful who are harming the fisherfolk, that is also my work. I wish I could say I'm very hopeful. I'm not hopeless either. I am keeping my hope because I see power of people succeeding in many other areas. If not for the fisherfolk of Bangladesh, at least workers' rights, we have seen progress through trade union movements. We have seen democracies falling and then people fighting to regain their voting rights or change entire constitutions even. People's movement do succeed. The only problem is there are so many dimensions of inequality, so many struggles everybody is entangled in. Sometimes many struggles get invisibilized. I think that is what happened with the fisherfolk. The changes that I'm seeing now, like initially when me or someone like me, others would talk about fisherfolk rights rather than conservation of fish, we were seen as an anomaly, a disturbance, and not someone who is appreciating the success of the conservation of nature. But now it's changing. I'm seeing more and more, especially young professionals, seeing the human dimensions. And at least in the media, we see both voices now. It's still not the dominant voice when it comes to the rights of fisherfolk, but it is there in the mainstream media, in social media, it's coming. So it's not a one-way narrative anymore, it's a debate. And I would call that progress. It's not enough because it's about people's lives and death. But I think more and more people are understanding as their eyes are opening up, because everybody in some way or the other, be it for climate change, be it for conflict, they are also facing consequences of the inequalities and unjust regulations, legislation, and world system. And when people see themselves in the shoes of the people they invisibilized, that leads to realization. So someone who is struggling for their rights, democratic rights, workers' rights, when they listen to the stories, when the storytelling is done in the right way, it does resonate. Even someone who has not ever seen or eaten a hilsa fish would be able to connect with the plea of the fisherfolk in Bangladesh or anywhere else in the world. And that gives me hope, because if we start listening, that means we will eventually work together and end this injustice. I'm here at the climate change convening of the Atlantic Fellows in Bogotá. Many of us coming from very different backgrounds. Some of us are working with trade unions, some of us are working with grassroots organizations, some of us are storytellers, some of us are grassroots fighters, some of us are policy influencers. It's a diverse group of people. The common thread that binds us is our perspective, our ability to see the interconnections between our many struggles. And climate justice work is one of those connectors. That's where we all find scope to collaborate. As we say, climate change is a symptom of the larger inequalities. It's a result of the inequalities rather than just the cause. For example, I was telling earlier that my work is diverse, but I'll stick to the work around the fishing rights or fisherfolk claiming their rights over the natural resources that they depend on, including the river systems. Now that's connected with climate change. I was talking about the fishing bans, which span from 22 days to 8 months, depending on what kind of regulations or restrictions we are talking about. And that time is a time when the fisherfolk cannot fish freely, but add cyclones with that, add floods with that, all the disasters that are influenced by climate change. Add extreme heat with that adds up to the working conditions getting worse for the fishing communities. Add cold wave with that, and that makes it really difficult. Climate change worsens the existing forms of inequalities, and that's where it's related. There are many ways we can tackle it, but I don't believe in just technical fixes because it's a political problem, political struggle. So the bigger work of ending climate change, that's where we all come together. But maybe at the local level, it's about formalizing the rights of fisherfolk as workers. It's about giving them insurances for their health, but also for the loss of working days due to cyclones and floods. Giving them better wages, living wages, so that they don't have to get trapped with loans and loan sharks. Working for better and more inclusive, just regulations, environmental regulations, be it for protected area management or fishing, so that fisherfolk do not become dependent on criminals or become vulnerable to the state-owned guns. So that means these fisherfolk, if they are one of the communities we work with, if they become independent truly, they also become part of our struggle for greater climate justice globally. As we say, there is no justice unless it's for everybody. And that's where climate justice work is connecting us all. I am also going to Cali, which is the UN Biodiversity Convention happening in Colombia. Environmental organizations, activists, environmental ministers, policymakers, journalists, everybody's convening there. It happens every 2 years. And those of us who work in the biodiversity space, it's one of the most important places. That's where consensus happens across nations. And that gets eventually reflected in how they act in their countries. It's not legally binding, but it still has a big influence. The reason I'm going is to really tell the stories which are invisibilized, like the stories of the fisherfolk of Bangladesh, but also to make allies. Because sometimes even with the best of intentions, we could have unintended consequences. We could come up with, for example, a target of having many more protected areas without realizing that that is just going to make many more communities vulnerable. We could end up take an easy path because complicated work requires a lot more effort. Like, for example, bringing back ecosystems in areas where you have the most powerful people with influence doing their economic activities or having their political control. Engaging there becomes more difficult. Therefore, people can choose to just focus on vulnerable communities and the land and ecosystems that the vulnerable communities have access and control over and make them protected areas. But that would just be simply wrong. That would not benefit nature. It would just exacerbate existing inequalities and injustices. I am just a small drop in the ocean. I don't know how much impact I will have, but I will keep telling my stories and the stories of others who I have heard.
That brings us to the end of this podcast. Thank you for listening. Next time we hear from Atlantic Fellows Pham Thi Ngoc Bic from Vietnam and Gil Lopez from the US as they discuss the importance of clean water for everyone. I'm Fionnuala Sweeney, and you've been listening to Atlantic Fellows Conversations from the Climate Action Convening in Colombia. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it on and subscribe to the series wherever you get your podcasts. If you'd like to learn more about Atlantic Fellows and their work for equity, please go to our website at www.atlanticfellows.org.